We're dealing with something remarkable, something very different at that particular location.
A routine highway project becomes a major archaeological discovery.
It's going to influence what people think about the initial occupations of eastern North America.
Hidden under the Virginia landscape, ancient artifacts form pieces of a prehistoric puzzle.
Now we have a great body of evidence and data about a relatively unknown time in the prehistory of Virginia.
A mystery, thousands of years in the making.
You're pushing back in time the presence of humans.
It's a great find, a once-in-a-lifetime find.
Discovering the First Virginians. It started out like any other day for these archaeologists from the Lewis Berger Group. They were digging along the path of a proposed expansion of Route 3 between Fredericksburg and Culpeper. The Virginia Department of Transportation had contracted these archaeologists to perform a routine cultural resource survey. Each year, scores of these studies are conducted throughout Virginia. Usually, they uncover few sites of national significance. There was no reason to believe the Route 3 corridor would be any different.
We did transects, shovel test transects, like these guys are doing shovel tests right here. They dig a hole about 30 centimeters in diameter, up to a meter deep, and they sift the soil through quarter-inch mesh screen to look for artifacts. Well, you know, we're out here to do archaeology, so sometimes negative shovel tests don't feel like you're doing archaeology.
Holes were dug at roughly 50-foot intervals. The Route 3 survey had produced hundreds of negative shovel tests that stretched for several miles. But Joe Parfit's shovel was about to hit pay dirt.
We were digging along. We entered a cedar grove, and I put in a shovel test. And when I put the first shovelful of dirt into the screen, and I shook the dirt to sift it out, it appeared to be all artifacts. I mean, it made a sound like a bunch of bottle glass rubbed across metal. I pretty much hooted and hollered a little bit. A shovel test might be considered to have a high frequency of artifacts if they have 15, and we had anywhere between 200 and 500 in some of the tests. There was more jasper in there than there was soil.
Jasper is a type of rock more commonly found in the Blue Ridge Mountains than in eastern Culpeper County. In fact, the nearest known source was 20 to 30 miles away. And as the shovel tests continued, archaeologists were finding jasper flakes by the hundreds. Joe Parfit's crew was not only digging up ancient artifacts, they were unearthing a mystery.
Well, I think people were pretty amazed, and we were all amazed because, as I said, you don't expect to find that quantity, plus the raw material, finding the jasper here in the middle of an area where there wasn't supposed to be any jasper was highly unusual. So right away we knew we had a really interesting site, and it was up to do additional work to really see what we did have.
The Lewis Berger Group evaluated the site to determine if it might contain important information about Virginia's prehistory. The additional work indicated this could be an ancient site capable of producing significant information about the earliest human occupation of Virginia. Soon, this peaceful cedar grove was abuzz with the activity of a full-scale archaeological excavation.
So we dug trenches, 4 trenches across the site from the top of the hill down towards existing Route 3. And it was in one of those trenches that we first encountered charcoal. And then as we kept getting deeper, then we could tell that there was something else going on, because we had not just the wood charcoal, but we had the burned siltstone, the burned native rock. We had burned artifacts and debitage and pieces of charcoal the size of my thumb. So we knew it just wasn't a natural scatter of charcoal, which you often get in the ground.
The discovery of this charcoal, along with the vast amounts of jasper, led Voigt and his group to believe they had stumbled upon the site of a prehistoric encampment. Here in the rolling hills of Virginia's Piedmont, just east of Brook Run, was evidence to suggest that this had been the site of extensive human activity thousands of years ago. The fact that archaeologists had found jasper artifacts was significant. An ideal type of rock for making tools, jasper was highly prized by Native Americans, especially the first inhabitants of present-day Virginia. Still, there were no finished tools, no spear points, and no traces of human remains to be found. With no other source of organic matter, the testing of the charcoal would be crucial in supplying all the hard evidence of the age of the Brook Run site. Samples of the charcoal were sent to Beta Analytic Incorporated in Florida. This Miami-based laboratory specializes in providing radiocarbon dates for archaeological projects worldwide.
It's very common to have samples, as in the case of the Brook Run samples, say the size of half a peanut, something like that. And with that size of sample now, we're going to extract the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide by putting the sample into a system full of oxygen, just like burning a match. A match burns because there's oxygen in the air. Well, there's only 20% oxygen in the air. With a radiocarbon sample, we put that sample into a system that's 100% oxygen, so 5 times more oxygen. So it burns very fast and very bright, and gives us carbon dioxide, but a very special carbon dioxide. The carbon in the carbon dioxide only belonged to that Brook Run charcoal sample. And we extract the carbon from that carbon dioxide as graphite, just like pencil lead, pure carbon. That pure carbon is put into a little metal container called a cathode. And this cathode is then put into the detector. Carbon is the basis of life, right? It's in everything that's living. Well, a very tiny amount of that is radioactive. The accelerator is going to be able to separate radioactive carbon from non-radioactive carbon. And we're going to be able to calculate how much radioactive carbon is there and use that in our age calculations.
The radiocarbon dating process for the Brook Run charcoal samples produced dates of 11,000 to 11,500 years old. This established Brook Run as one of the oldest sites in the eastern United States.
Here with these dates, we had an extremely old site with very good preservation here in central Virginia, which is extremely rare, so we were feeling pretty good.
The charcoal was able to tell us 2 things. It's able to actually give us a measurable age for that occupation. The charcoal was also able to give us some direct evidence of a different climate for this part of Virginia. Some of the charcoal came from spruce, and right now spruce in Virginia is restricted to the highest elevations of the Appalachians. So we're dealing with a climate that was considerably cooler. So that alone indicated that we were dealing with a late Ice Age, a late Pleistocene occupation of Virginia. The Virginia that the average person today recognizes would not have existed. For example, the Chesapeake Bay didn't exist at the end of the last Ice Age because sea level was considerably lower. All of that water in the ocean was tied up in the glaciers and the polar cap. So what we now know as the Chesapeake Bay really would have been the lower reaches of the Susquehanna River. And it wasn't until after the Ice Age, when sea level started rising, that the Chesapeake Bay was created. So that alone can give you the indication that you're really dealing with a very different Virginia when the first people came here.
Albert Goodyear has been studying a similar site in South Carolina. He is an expert on Paleo-Indians, the name given to the earliest human occupants of North America.
Glaciers covered most of North America and Canada, until about 14 or 15,000 years ago. As the world began to warm and the glaciers receded, that had climatic and biotic implications for hunters and gatherers as well. They were living and coping in a very changing world. One of the most dramatic changes that happened at the end of the last Ice Age was the extinction of several large terrestrial mammals in North America, not the least of which were mammoth and mastodon, a form of now extinct bison, horse, camel, dire wolf, things like that.
The first humans to arrive in Virginia were forced to adapt quickly to the changing environment. They were nomadic by necessity.
Their activities moving across the landscape are based upon their economy, what it takes for them to obtain the materials to survive. It's also going to be based upon how often individual smaller bands need to come together as larger bands for social interaction. People are social. That hasn't changed since the last ice age. We don't understand a lot about the size of the territory that they would move within. They would be small bands. You can imagine an extended family, and most of their routine is going to be based upon the seasonal availability of game to hunt and other material to gather.
And one of the most important necessities was stone for fashioning tools and spears. The Paleo-Indians of Virginia soon learned to recognize the types of rock that could easily be shaped. There are no arrowheads from this period. The invention of the bow and arrow was still thousands of years away. However, spear points from this period have unique characteristics and are known as Clovis points.
In Clovis culture, dates to about 13,000 to 13,500 years ago, and it is known for their well-made stone spear points, such as what I'm holding in my hand here, with this very diagnostic flute. You just can't make beautiful spear points, such as I'm holding here, on just any kind of rock. And the very interesting thing about the Paleo-Indians is they seem to know almost from the beginning where those rock sources were.
And finding a source of jasper would have been a major discovery.
And because it's such an exceptional material, you can flake it easily, and it produces a very, very sharp edge. And because it's such a high-grade material, you can actually use that edge over and over again, resharpen that edge over and over again. So compared to the quartz and the quartzite cobbles that you usually find in the Piedmont and this part of Virginia, jasper is really an incredibly wonderful raw material, sort of like a gold mine, a veritable gold mine when you find something like this jasper here.
Keith Googans was among the crew working for Eric Voigt at Brook Run. Fueled by his interest in archaeology, Googans has learned the ancient craft of flint knapping. Using a toolkit consisting of cobbles, elk, and moose antlers, he fashioned spear points like those of the Paleo-Indians. Googans says this gives him a better understanding of the skill of these first Americans.
What I'm trying to get the rock to do is not crush, but just to break in a controlled manner. Yeah, like that. I'm trying to get it where I can strike off a large flake that'll take off most of that face. Okay. So maybe I could even demonstrate how sharp it is. Very sharp. It's actually most vulnerable at this stage. I'm just gonna get this to the point where I'm gonna stop with it. This could have been used as is as a knife or a projectile point. Could have been reused after resharpening. A lot of the ones we find are actually a lot shorter.
It was obvious to the archaeologists that the jasper flakes they were finding at Brook Run were the debris of this stone toolmaking, somewhat like prehistoric sawdust. Practical thinking would have led one to assume all the artifacts would be near the surface. They appeared at a depth of 1 foot in the initial shovel tests. Further digging revealed flakes 3 feet below ground. Determined to find the final depth of the artifacts, the crew continued to dig and continued to find jasper even to a depth of 13 feet.
My first reaction is, why is this here? But then we started to find some of these jasper nodules the size of bowling balls, and I mean that literally. So it raised a whole variety of red flags.
As the excavation holes deepened, so did the mystery. Why were such vast quantities of jasper being brought to this seemingly insignificant spot in Virginia's landscape? The nearest recorded source of jasper was miles to the west. The closest river, the Rapidan, was miles to the south. Could this site have been the location of an important swamp 11,000 years ago? Perhaps this was a fertile hunting ground. What local resource was so important to make these early Virginians establish a camp at Brook Run?
We were really mystified why folks were carrying these things long distances to this spot in the middle of nowhere. So that part of the puzzle still hadn't been resolved as we continue our excavations, and it was one of the things that the last sort of missing piece of the puzzle. We had the dates, we had the flora, we had the technology, we had the jasper, we had all the pieces, but the whole thing is the behavior. Why were people stopping here and doing the work?
To help answer this question, Voigt turned to an old colleague, soil expert Dan Hayes.
At that point in time, I did a little analysis of the landform for them and determined that there was no very good reason to explain why they were finding that material far below the surface, unless it had been that somebody had actually put it there at one point in time. Since then, it's been kind of an interesting ride. The volume of rock we were finding at this particular spot kind of pointed to the fact that it was probably a fairly local source. But doing map work and doing reviews of archaeological records and things like that, we didn't really have anything that would indicate that there should be a lot of jasper in this area. As we were continuing our work here, we found just absolutely amazing amounts of jasper, and in sizes, blocks the size of 5-10 pound bags of flour. And it didn't make a lot of sense to us that people would actually be transporting pieces of rock that size any great distance at this particular spot. Our idea was that perhaps if we were to work in the little streams around here, we might actually find some jasper that would actually lead us to a source material in the uplands.
I spent time walking up and down the creeks and going down to the rivers looking for nodules of jasper and didn't find anything. And the creek beds are all the native greenstone, siltstone, mudstones.
The Brook Run crew was not only running out of theories, they were running out of time. With no new information being generated on the use of the site, the allotted time for the excavations was drawing to a close. The day before the dump trucks were to begin filling the holes, the crew identified a crack in the bedrock at the base of one of the excavation units. A backhoe was called in to dig just a few feet deeper. With less than 24 hours remaining to solve the puzzle, the backhoe's metal scoop uncovered a rock formation that was to be the missing piece.
It was at that point that we realized then that we had a fault between two members of bedrock, local bedrock, and that seam was filled with all the debris from mining jasper out of the seam. So all this time we'd been digging and doing backhoe work and everything else trying to find it. It was literally right below our feet as we did the work.
Well, it's pretty exciting to find jasper in a primary source in an odd spot like this. And then much of the different pieces of the site began to fall together and make a little more sense.
So we found they weren't really making the tools here. What they would do, it was like an industrial operation. They were coming here, mining the jasper, making it into a transportable item they could then take who knows how far away and make their tools at the campsite or where they were living.
I have never seen a mining site here in Virginia that's as intensively used as Brook Run, in which the people who are doing the mining are going through such extraordinary efforts to dig down into a geological fault 12 feet below the surface of the ground with stone tools, with hand tools, and to extract large nodules of jasper out of a seam that may only be 8 to 10 inches wide. That's an extraordinary amount of effort, and I've not seen it from any other archaeological site that I've been exposed to.
At that point in time, it must have been a very dangerous and very tricky situation to be down in there. There's a few places in the fault where we've seen it looks like there actually may have been a small rock slide where the upper part of the walls along the joint cracked and fell in. It must have been a very difficult place to work. And I think that plus probably problems with groundwater, they may actually have given up on continuing their excavations any deeper at that point. Oftentimes quarry sites have been used by people over a period of 3, 4, 5, 10,000 years. This site is very unique in the fact that it was used for a relatively short period of time. We were finding large blocks of jasper here that had been discarded that probably would have been used at almost any other archaeological site. Had this site been rediscovered, they would have done extensive pit digging within this particular site just to pick up all the waste material left behind. This would have been a treasure trove of good stone for making tools.
The advantage of finding a quarry site is that we know that particular material came from this spot in the landscape.
And that knowledge has great potential for archaeologists as they discover new sites in the future. Samples from Brook Run were sent to the Archaeometry Laboratory at the Missouri University Research Reactor. Here in this reactor, the jasper's chemical and physical properties were documented and charted. This process gives the Brook Run jasper a distinctive chemical fingerprint, different from jasper found at other sources.
We can start using that chemical and physical fingerprint to go out to other sites in the region to be able to see if the small amounts of jasper that are from these other sites can be traced back to Brook Run. And if they can, that can tell us a lot about trading networks. It can tell us a lot about the size of a band's territory.
There may have been several minimal groups like that that knew of each other and were related, perhaps 400 or 500 of them, that may perhaps have wandered over an area the size of the state of Virginia. We don't know. We can track their movements by the raw material, in this case a jasper origin point and a jasper deposition point, so we can get some sense of the geographic range.
Is it 100 square miles? Is it 500 square miles? We really don't know that. But the raw material that we've gotten from Brook Run has a great potential for filling in these gaps in our knowledge for this very, very early time period in Virginia's history.
When you go back thousands of years, there's not much left in the ground that represents evidence of human presence. Stone tools seem to just about last forever, so that's why archaeologists are so intrigued by stone tool technologies. However, in many cases, that's all we have to work with. With the passage of time, other organic artifacts, bone, shell, wood, feathers, of course, would have dissipated rather rapidly. So typically we have to work this out with the stone tools.
With over 750,000 artifacts from stone toolmaking, the Brook Run site could become as important to archaeologists as it was to the early inhabitants of Virginia.
The density of archaeological materials on the site probably exceeds 99% of the sites in Virginia by maybe a factor of 1,000. I mean, it's just extremely dense, rich site.
You could probably say it's 1,000,000 to 1 or even greater odds. Finding a site like this is so rare, maybe out of the 10,000 sites in Virginia, this is the only site like this. So, think of those odds.
It was a long shot that the site was ever discovered.
We probably put in hundreds of shovel tests along this road and only found artifacts, or a significant number of artifacts, right here at this site. But, if the road had been on the other side of the highway, we never would have found it. If it had been 50 feet to the north of the highway, we never would have found it.
Sites from this particular time period are so rare that to think that we would have encountered one on what we were thinking was a typical highway project was remarkable.
So remarkable, in fact, that it caused the Route 3 expansion plans to take an unexpected detour.
We talked to VDOT. We came out with their surveyors. They shot the site in and realized that they could redesign the road, have a safe road, and still preserve the site.
And we were able to reduce the cross-section of that particular road and move the two new lanes closer to the existing lanes of Route 3.
The Brook Run site will now remain within public right-of-way, preserved in perpetuity. That's good news for Eric Voigt.
Because of the complexity of the site and many of the questions we had when we first started working on the site, it actually allowed me to really be an archaeologist. I mean, I really had to think a lot about what was going on in the field and what was really happening here. It's not like a site where you had features where you could see, oh, this is a pit, and here's the pottery, and here's a corn kernel. You can really tell what's going on. You really had to really think about how did the site take shape and what were people doing here. So it was great in that way. Archaeology is always like a detective story because you're dealing with clues about a past, and it's how you put those clues together to form a picture of what was going on where you're working. But here it had several unique characteristics that made it a more interesting puzzle than usual.
The on-site archaeological work has finished, at least for now. Recognizing Brook Run's importance and its potential to aid researchers in the future, special efforts have been made for the site's protection and preservation. The excavation holes have been filled with manufactured sand to prevent erosion and to distinguish the fill material from the remaining archaeological deposits. The site has been covered by a geotextile fabric, then covered again with a layer of topsoil and grass. This will help protect the Brook Run site for generations to come.
50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years or more from now, archaeologists would be able to come back and re-examine that site, conduct additional research there. We're not making any assumptions that we have answered all the questions that could potentially be answered relying on the Brook Run site. We can certainly assure that it's not going anywhere.
So the Brook Run site, with its unique story of an ancient past, will remain just below the surface of Virginia's landscape, unseen by human eyes, just as it has for 10,000 years.